How has India's revised obesity parameters? Why has it been revised after 15 years? What are the health issues that can develop due to obesity? India has revised guidelines for obesity treatment and diagnosis after 15 years. The move comes after a call for global recalibration on how obesity is measured. In a recent report published in the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology, the Global Commission noted that BMI, apart from the distribution of body fat, is also a key indicator of overall health and disease patterns. In step with this report, experts in India, including a group of doctors, nutritionists, and others from the National Diabetes, Obesity, and Cholesterol Foundation, Fortis CDOC Hospital, and the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, have issued updated guidelines for India. The revised classification system introduces two stages in obesity: innocuous obesity, characterized by increased body fat without organ or metabolic dysfunction. The second stage is obesity with consequences marked by the impact of physical functions and presence of obesity related diseases. This framework places special emphasis on abdominal fat distribution, which has particularly adverse effects on Asian Indian populations. तो रिवाइज क्लासिफिकेशन दो स्टेजेस ओबेसिटी के लेके आती है. एक इनोकुअस ओबेसिटी है, increased body fat without organ or metabolic dysfunction. Second stage is obesity with consequences marked by the impact on physical functions and presence of obesity related diseases. Important development occurred in 2009 when India introduced revised obesity definitions specifically for Asian Indians. This revision acknowledged that Asian Indians are typically have higher body fat percentages than Western populations and develop diabetes at low BMI levels. The new guidelines set threshold for BMI criteria which are now adjusted downward, with overweight defined at 23 to 24.9 kg per meter square and obesity at 25 kg per meter square compared to Western standards of 25 and 30. Also, ideal waist lengths uh, have to be 90 centimeter for men and 80 centimeter for women, lower than Western standards of 102 and 88 centimeter respectively. These guidelines influenced obesity management for South Asians in other countries and sparked numerous research studies that deepened the understanding of obesity in Asian Indian populations. Why are Indian bodies different? Studies show that the excess fat in Indian population leads to higher levels of inflammation and metabolic disturbance at low BMI thresholds compared to Western populations. The only available antidote is to start exercising and have a diet plan early in life. The current report states that using BMI alone to diagnose obesity is not a reliable measure of health or illness at the individual level. This can result in misdiagnosis with negative consequences for people living with obesity. A secondary analysis of trends of prevalence patterns and predicators from 2005 to 2020 using National Family Health Survey shows that in a 15-year period, the prevalence of overweight or obese among the women and men aged 15 and 49 years increased from 12.6% to 24% and 9.3 to 22.9% respectively. This indicates that almost one fourth of the population, both men and women, are currently either overweight or obese in India. Secondary analysis trends NFHS showed that over a 15-year period, the prevalence of overweight or obese BMI greater than 25 kg per meter square among women and men aged between 15 to 49 increased from 12.6 to 24% and 9.3% to 22% respectively. This indicates that almost one fourth of the population are currently either overweight or obese in India. The prevalence of obesity BMI greater than 30 also increased for more than twice. What does obesity do to the body? Naval Vikram, Department of Medicine, AIMS say studies have shown strong correlation between abdominal obesity in individuals, resulting in inflammation and early onset of diseases with comorbidity. Abdominal fat, which is closely linked to insulin resistance and prevalent in Asian Indians, is now recognized as a key factor in the diagnosis. The new definition integrates the presence of comorbidities such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease into the diagnostic process, ensuring that obesity related health risks are better accounted for and taken care in management, he pointed out. An early diagnosis translates into targeted management strategies. There is also inclusion of mechanical problems associated with obesity, for example, knee and hip arthritis, etc., or shortness of breath during daily activities, which leads to poor quality of life. Commission Chair Francesco Rubino, King's College London said, "We now know that some individuals with obesity can maintain normal organs function and overall health even long term, whereas others display signs and symptoms of severe illness here and now." He noted that considering obesity only as a risk factor and never a disease can unfairly deny access to time sensitive care among people who are experiencing ill health due to obesity alone. What do Trump's early decrees signal? What is 47th US President's governance paradigm? What are some of the controversial decisions besides ending birthright citizenship and withdrawing US from the WHO? How will they impact domestic and foreign policies? Will the spree of executive orders face legal challenges? The US President Donald Trump signed a number of executive orders and actions into force in the early days of his term in office, which began when he sworn in on January 20. Following multiple promises made on the campaign trail leading to the 24 presidential election, Mr. Trump controversially issued a spree of executive orders in the first week itself. Mr. Trump issued over 1,500 pardons to individuals prosecuted for their role in the riot at US Capitol in 2021, alongside orders mandating the US exit from the Paris Climate Agreement and the WHO. He also signed an order ending birthright citizenship, protecting under the US Constitution's 14th Amendment for children of undocumented migrants and those of temporary visas. He proposed a 100% conditional tariff on BRICS nations and a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico from February 1, while declaring a national emergency on the US southern border with Mexico. He also reversed 78 executive orders and memoranda of his predecessors Joe Biden. While each of these decrees will likely impact the governance paradigm of US, some if not most of these executive orders will face legal challenges and may ultimately be reversed. The broader Trump political agenda is nevertheless expected to significantly change the status quo in the US after the coming 4 years in the realm of domestic and foreign policy. Speaking at a news conference regarding his blanket pardon that effectively freed the rioters and erased the work of largest criminal investigation in US history, Trump said these people have already served years in prison and they have served them viciously. It's disgusting prison, it's inhumane, it's a terrible, terrible thing. The grant of clemency came despite January 6 congressional investigation running for 2 years between 21 to 23 and its committee interviewing over 1,000 people and reviewing more than a million documents. At the end of the inquiry, the courts charged more than 1,500 people associated with the attack on US Capitol, including former leaders of Oath Keepers and Proud Boys convicted of seditious conspiracy and violent acts. Lawyers for these defendants were themselves said to be pleasantly surprised by the Mr. Trump's pardons, given that Vice President J.D. Vance has recently said that only non-violent offenders would get relief, and Mr. Trump's Attorney General Pick Pam Bondi noted in the Congress earlier that she did not believe that violent rioters ought to be pardoned. On one hand, the attempted reading down of the 14th Amendment has already been challenged in court by 22 states and is likely to fail, according to legal experts. A federal judge in Seattle, Washington, has already described Mr. Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship as blatantly unconstitutional and issued a temporary restraining order to block it for at least 2 weeks while awaiting further briefings on the overall legal challenge. However, the immigration raids that Mr. Trump promised vociferously during the campaign have begun in earnest, with over 21 actions issued towards overhauling the immigration system and mass deportations and arrests promised. The immigration and customs enforcements have already deported 1,000 individuals and detained 5,000 in the state of Texas. In some cases, flying them out of military aircraft with the cooperation of Department of Defense. Mr. Trump has said on several occasions that he is in favor of legal migration, even if he intends to close the US border to undocumented migrants. While the president has his billionaire supporter Elon Musk have often spoken out in favor of temporary work visas for skilled migrants, including the H-1B visa, which which applicants from India are most frequently granted, some members of the more conservative wing of the Republican Party have opposed any expansion in the H-1B quotas and have argued for bringing back jobs for the American workers. Under the first Trump term from 2016 to 20, the US exited from the Paris Climate Agreement, a move that was reserved by Mr. Biden on his first day in office. On his first day in office, Mr. Trump again exited the Paris Pact, describing it as unfair, one-sided ripoff, pointing out that the US will not sabotage their own industries while China pollutes with impunity. With the war cry of drill baby drill, Mr. Trump has gone further to declare a national energy emergency, which is not only a signal of Mr. Trump's promise of energy expansion, but specifically opens the doors to the federal use of eminent domain and Defense Production Act, which would allow the government to take charge of private lands and other resources to produce goods that might be deemed to be national necessity. However, not only does this mean that US will officially halt all contributions towards limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, but it also does so at the peril of even more climatic events with profound impact on the country. The tenor of the second Trump administration, in terms of its early policy agenda, appears to be fundamentally hostile to the progressive agenda to the Democrats. To an extent that is expected, as the two major parties have always diverged considerably on policy subjects. However, previous Republican governments would regularly seek to build bridges with Democratic lawmakers in Congress and in states to build bipartisan consensus across critical political issues rather than risk stalemates and fruitless conflicts over policy priorities and funding. What is significant about Mr. Trump's second victory, however, is the fact that he now enjoys a federal government trifecta and a sympathetic Supreme Court stacked 6-3 in favor of conservatives. This implies that Mr. Trump and his administration need to rely even less on his support from the across the aisle than they did during the first term. Further, he has clarified being emboldened by the fact that he won such a wide election victory encompassing more demographic cohorts of voters to the point where even unconventional policy priorities have started to enter the proposed policy agenda. He has announced plans to take over the Panama Canal, de-recognize transgender rights, and Washington has threatened Denmark with its intention to take over Greenland and the possibility of a ban on travelers from certain countries entering the US. Why has the US often exited climate pacts? Why? What have the presidents done in the past on global agreements? What are the reasons offered for withdrawing the US from Kyoto Protocol or the Paris Act? How will another withdrawal impact the developing world? Where does the US stand on greenhouse emissions? Among the first executive orders that the Donald Trump signed after taking over as president on January 20 was to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement of 2015. This makes it the third time the US has withdrawn from a treaty signed under UNFCCC. The first time US withdrew from a climate agreement was in 2001 when President George W. Bush exited the Kyoto Protocol adopted in 1997. This agreement was significant as it was the first time 37 industrialized countries has binding targets to lower carbon dioxide emissions. However, Mr. Bush withdrew the US on the grounds that it crippled the economy. I oppose the Kyoto Protocol because it exempts 80% of the world, including major population centers such as China and India, from compliance and would cause serious harm to the US economy. When Mr. Trump first withdrew from the US, from the Paris Agreement in 2017, his reasons were: I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris, and the Paris deal hamstrings the US while empowering some of the world's top polluting countries. That is not going to happen when I am president. Exiting the agreement meant the US would cease to implement a target to cut emissions and contribute to a green climate fund, a corpus to help climate vulnerable countries adapt to climate change. In the new order, 8 years later, he says that the Paris Agreement steered American taxpayer dollars to countries that do not require or merit financial assistance in the interest of American people. However, when the US withdrew in 2017, it did not practically result in an election. Technicalities in the drafting of the Paris Agreement meant it would take signatory country 3 years to withdraw and an extra year intimating the United Nations governing body. This meant that by the time the withdrawal took effect in November 2020, Joe Biden had already been elected in the 46th US president, and in 2021 he promptly signed US back in. The Paris Agreement committed all countries to collectively strive to keep temperatures from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius or pre-industrial times, failing which to keep it below 2 degrees Celsius. Unlike Mr. Trump's 2017 order, his latest order will withdraw the US within a year. Until 2006, the US was the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. As the world's largest economy, its general attitude towards the European Union backed climate pacts have been to project itself as solving climate crisis but not being non-committal towards taking the legally binding emission cuts that this entailed. Right from the first conference of parties in Bonn in 1995, US expressed discomfort with the fundamental axiom of the UNFCCC, the Mother Convention that gives treaties such as Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement meaning. This is because carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere were largely due to historical emissions developed by developed countries. It was incumbent on them to pay the bulk of the cost for cleanup. It also translated to developing countries continuing on a fossil fuel pathway due to discomfort expressed by major fossil fuel economies. The US, Australia, and Canada ideas such as joint implementation, where countries earn credits for implementing clean energy projects in developing countries, surface. The US, despite having walked out of climate agreements, continue to send large delegations to the conference as observers, be closely involved in negotiations. In 2005, at COP11 in Montreal, Canada, the head of US delegation, as reported by the New York Times, walked out of the negotiations despite the US not being part of Kyoto Protocol at the time. To cut the present, there is a bipartisan support for not crimping oil and gas production in the US oil and gas production, and the gas production in the US oil and gas production has risen under the Biden administration. The US remains the world's largest crude oil producer and achieved record production in 23. The country is also largest producer of gas and in 2022 became largest exporter of LNG. Mr. Trump has committed to adding to this substantial base. Despite all this, US is critically short of achieving greenhouse emission target. As of 22, US has achieved only one-third of its 2030 emissions reduction goal. In the last week of its presidency, Mr. Biden increased the US emissions reduction commitment to 61% to 66% of the 2005 levels by 2035. The US has only exited the Paris Agreement, not the overarching framework, overarching UNFCCC. Several analysts have pointed out that the scale of investment in renewable energy, including private finance from the US, have vastly grown since 2017. Unlike India, China, and Indonesia, large developing economies dependent on coal, US is less reliant on it. The US has historically supported the EU anti-coal positions in the climate negotiations. Mr. Trump's espousal of drill baby drill motto encourages more fracking and oil and gas drilling, which prevents dispensations, have only modestly slowed. The US exit might lead to developing countries taking on less ambitious targets, but given that climate targets have not managed to slow down global emissions, the US exit at this point means little.